Next thing, number 3, is workflow. Right? And workflow doesn't have a real technical ring to it, but it's important to understand workflow. If now I'm recognizing that, okay, the problem might be with the marketers and the hardware engineers, right? What I want to do now is I want to take this macro account, because I'm looking at this whole system, and I forgot to mention that. This is a macro. This is a macro account, meaning it's a very large scale. I'm looking at the structure of the system as such, right? This is a macro account. I want to transition at this point, at the point of workflow, from a macro account to a micro. From a macro to a micro account. So what I want to do now is I want to specifically look at just the managers and the hardware. Not the managers. This is I forgot what MAG stand for. Marketers. Okay. All right. The marketers and the hardware designers. Right. I want to look at this workflow. Okay. So the second thing in program evaluation is now to do a thorough assessment of workflow. All right. How do we begin an analysis of workflow? Okay. The first thing to recognize is workflow has absolutely nothing to do with HR, right? It has nothing to do with HR. It has nothing to do with human resources. It really has nothing to do with labor, right? The biggest misconception is to think that workflow pertains to labor. It has nothing to do with labor. Workflow has to do with an analysis of how specific or subordinate members within a process, right, function. So workflow has to do with functionality. Workflow pertains to functionality. How does that specific thing that I'm analyzing now, specific, remember it's micro, how does that specific thing that I'm analyzing function? So, we use this, my Rubik's Cube, right? So my Rubik's Cube has a particular function, right? It functions, you have to try and solve it. I'm not going to, there's no need to do that. That's not the point of the example. But if I wanted to understand the workflow of this, how this thing works, I would need to, in a sense, take it apart, right? To see that there's a structure beneath this that's allowing this dynamic process, right? The process that happened before to work, right? So that the workflow is, in a sense, it is the engine that drives the process, right? I've observed what this thing is. I recognize that it's a complex sort of interrelation of many different fixed objects, and I realize that this system is rather complicated. But I recognize that there must be something that's allowing this thing to work, right? That workflow behind this is the function. So a chair, the function of the chair is that you can sit in it, right? You don't lie or sleep in a chair. It's no longer a chair if you sleep in it, right? A chair is to be sat in. You might have a chair with one leg versus a chair with 3 legs versus a chair with 4 legs, but it still serves the same function. There's actually a really interesting lecture that I could do on Aristotle, but I won't get into that now. When we're talking about workflow, we're talking about the function. So the question to then ask, now that we understand all of that, the question to then ask is what? Well, what is the function? What is the function of X? What is the function of X? X being whatever this thing is. What is the function of the marketing department in this corporation, right? Don't assume that all marketing departments, for example, serve the same function. They might not. You need to understand the particular dynamics, process of this system to understand what the function of these marketers are, right? If I've located a potential problem, then I need to know what is the function of X, what is the function of the hardware manufacturers. And they'll tell you, oh, the function of the hardware manufacturers is to do whatever, X, right? So you ask the question, what is the function of whoever the department is, or the person, or the field, or whatever it is that you're analyzing? Let's use curriculum. If I'm starting to recognize that it might be a problem with the curriculum designer and sort of student expectation or like accreditation body, right? You can imagine that there's a tension between what the accreditation body wants and what the students expect or want themselves, and there's a possible tension there. It doesn't have to be anything like this. Well, what is the function of this thing, whatever it is that you're analyzing, and what is the function of that thing? Right? There should be a very exact response. Well, that thing is so that you can sit in. Well, the accrediting body, if that's what we're talking about, is to make sure that there are consistencies in pedagogy, there's consistencies in curriculum, whatever. Right? The marketers, well, the function of the marketers is to increase sales, right? And you want to get to the root of what the function of that thing is, right? To market the product, to show the product, to entice customers, and so on. What's the function of the engineers? To build the structures, to make sure that it's safe, to make sure that it can perform. So we'll talk about performance and all that. Okay, once you understand what the function of X is, right? So you're going to ask the question, what the function of this thing is. The response to this is so the question is, what is the function of X? The response is, the function is Y, we'll just say. The function is Y. You want to make sure that you understand that, whatever that thing is, right? What is the function of this? Where I think the problem is, what is it that these guys do? What is their function? What do they do? Okay, well, they do X, they do Y. Jot that down, and now you have an understanding of what it is that they do, right? In understanding what it is that they do, you now recognize the workflow, right? How work is changed, how work is created, right? You understand that what happens is they get raw material, maybe the engineers, the hardware engineers get raw material, and that raw material is transformed into fabricated parts, right? That's the workflow. It doesn't really pertain to the labor used to change that, as it does to the fact that what came in was, so it'd be like this, what comes in are parts, and what is created is let's say a product, and so on, right? So that's what you're looking for, this transition, right? This change. So that the last thing to recognize is that anytime we're talking about functionality, anytime we're talking about workflow, you're looking, as an evaluator, looking for instances, instances of change. A chair, the function of a chair is for me to sit. You know that it's functioning properly when my posture has changed. I'm no longer standing, I'm now sitting. It is functioning properly as a chair if it supports that change. If I sit in the chair and I fall on my butt and I'm on the floor, well, it has failed its function, right? Its workflow is deficient because now it's not supporting the posture that it should support. Marketers are failing if their marketing and their advertisement isn't enticing customers. And then you can get deeper and deeper into that problem, right? So that's the third thing to recognize, which is workflow. Okay. So we talked about and I'll erase this. We talked about the observation, we talked about workflow, we talked about processes. The next thing to recognize is at this point, we want to start thinking of efficiency, right? So we'll cross efficiency off. And technically, I could talk about effectiveness first, but it doesn't really matter. So we'll talk about efficiency. And the question is, well, what is efficiency, right?